For book review number 8, we have We Can Build You by Philip K. Dick. Pretty cool title, especially for a Philip K. Dick novel, because if you know anything about Philip K. Dick, his titles tended to be a little goofy. Like, Blade Runner was based on one of his stories, and the story was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And then Total Recall was based on another Philip K. Dick story called We Can Remember It For You Wholesale. And so he didn't create the most cinematic titles. His titles tended to be kind of irreverent. And that's one of the reasons why a lot of people don't realize his contribution to science fiction. And that's what I'm going to talk about before I actually talk about this novel, is Philip K. Dick himself. Philip K. Dick was born in 1928, and he died in 1982, so he didn't live a very long life. If he were alive today, he'd be almost 100 years old, which is kind of crazy to think about. He writes so relatably, though. I mean, somebody reading this today would have no problem. I mean, there's no stuffiness in his writing at all. He talks very much like just a regular person who could be living in this era. But he was born in 1928, and that's kind of an interesting thing to note about him, because the fact that he was born in 1928 is the cutoff year between the GI generation and the silent generation. And that's appropriate that he was born on that borderline year, because he was very much kind of a transitional figure himself in science fiction. Whereas the golden age sci-fi writers of the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, guys like Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, guys who were born in the teens and early 20s, they were the golden age sci-fi writers, and they had a style of science fiction that was very different from the sci-fi that emerged in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I would call that era the silver age of science fiction. And I kind of credit Philip K. Dick with being the father of that silver age. And it's hard to deny, like I said, when you think about all of the groundbreaking movies and TV shows that were based on his work, if not actual stories themselves, at least inspired by ideas that he introduced and concepts that he introduced. I think, cyberpunk came about, I think, partially because of him. Just this new style of science fiction. Like, whereas the golden age sci-fi was optimistic, it was about reaching out to the stars, it was mostly about space travel. It was about that kind of stuff. Kind of Star Trek, Flash Gordon, Space Ranger type stuff. It's about having adventures on other planets. Philip K. Dick's style of science fiction, and the style that sort of gained prominence from the 60s into the 70s, 80s, and 90s, was more of an introspective science fiction. It wasn't about reaching to outer space. It was about reaching inward to inner space. It was about exploring consciousness and the mind, and what it means to be human, what it means to be a conscious being. And oftentimes, Philip K. Dick's main characters are not better off in the end, whereas the Golden Age characters are heroes, and they usually have some kind of a happy ending, typically, conventionally. Philip K. Dick's style of science fiction is much more cynical, much more uncertain. It questions authority, it questions society. I mean, it's very, very similar to what was going on in history at the time, in the 1960s and 70s. It was a very uncertain time, although I'm sure we're all getting sick of that phrase after living through 2020 and 2021. But it just kind of reflected the era, and Philip K. Dick, I think, was uniquely good at reflecting that in his writing. He lived in California, and he was kind of from the beatnik generation, and he kind of could relate to the college kids who were all around, who were surrounding him in the 60s and 70s, who were questioning authority and questioning convention. He could relate to those kids, and he also had his demons. He was mentally ill, and I'll actually get into that in this novel, because this novel has kind of two main plot points. And it's funny because at about the 150 page mark, the subplot of the novel becomes the main plot, and then the main plot kind of disappears. And one of the reasons that it took me so long to get this review out is because, number one, I had a lot of stuff to do outside, so I didn't read as much. And then also, this book is a little bit longer than the books I have been reading, but although not by much. That really doesn't make that big of a difference in how long it took me to finish it. But the real reason, I think, is the fact that at the 150 page mark, it just turns into a completely different novel, and it's almost like it turns into its own sequel, like a novella that's a sequel to the novel, and it's just a completely different story with the same characters. And I just kind of lost interest a little bit, because I was really I mean, look at that badass cover. I mean, I can't believe that we're like almost 7 minutes into this, and I haven't even mentioned how cool this cover is. This is a Daw novel, and all of the Philip K. Dick books I've read 4 of them now. This is the 4th one. They've all been Daw editions, and Daw had the coolest covers. I bought all of these from a Goodwill store when I was a teenager. I've had them now for almost 20 years. So it took me almost 20 years to get around to reading this one. But and then you have the Abraham Lincoln, who is an android. And I don't know why, but Abraham Lincoln shows up in science fiction quite a bit. Like he's either in Westworld, or he's made of... he's not actually in Westworld, but he's in a Westworld type story. Or he's an android, or he's traveling through time, or he's hunting zombies. I mean, it seems like Abe Lincoln shows up in sci-fi a lot. But yeah, I was getting back to the whole mental illness thing. Philip K. Dick, and this was written in the late 60s, so it's one of his earlier novels. And I think it was written right after the Blade Runner novel. And it's similar subject matter, of course. But I think at this point in his life, I think he was definitely dealing with some shit. And I think it shows through in this novel, and I almost feel like this novel was kind of his way of trying to deal with stuff going on in his own life. Now, I don't know that for sure, but I have watched a documentary about Philip K. Dick, and judging by what I heard in that documentary, it would make perfect sense. And the fact that he kind of uses this book as a vehicle to deal with his own issues, I think that the story, the novel, suffers because of it. And I'm going to tell you right now, of the 4 Philip K. Dick novels I've read, this one has to be my least favorite. I'm not saying it's bad, but the end of it kind of made me kind of scratch my head and think to myself, what exactly was the purpose of this novel? It does really get derailed at about the 150 page mark. It's almost like Dick kind of wrote himself into a corner, or he was dealing with stuff in his own life, and he didn't feel like he could finish it, come up with an ending that was fitting for it, so he ended up kind of just doing a stream of consciousness thing that was based on what he was going through. Because in this novel, it's interesting because it's kind of similar to this. It takes place in an alternate 1980s. It's an alternate. It's retro-futuristic, which every sci-fi novel that was set in what was then the future and is now the past. All sci-fi books of that type become retro-futuristic with time. And this one is retro-futuristic because it takes place in an alternate 1980s, which of course never happened. And the technology that is described in this world is kind of interesting. You have Boeing 900 rocket-powered planes. there's a scene where there's a part where the main character Lewis Rosen actually sneaks a firearm onto a plane, which of course wouldn't be possible. Certainly not now. I mean, maybe in the I don't think even in the 1980s of our world, I don't think that would have it would have been difficult. Really fast cars that go routinely over 100 miles an hour on the highway. Spaceships, of course, because this was in the 60s, and so there was a lot more optimism about space travel. Of course, in our world, space travel kind of hit a standstill over the last 30 years or so. We had space shuttles, and that was pretty much it. We didn't go to other planets. I honestly don't expect to see people go to Mars in my lifetime, because space travel just really has become kind of deprioritized, unless Elon Musk can make that happen. But I don't know. I just have my doubts about that. But and you also have, of course, advanced robotics, because the main character, Louis Rosen, and his business partner, Maury Rock, they own an organ company, an electronic organ company, Mood Organs, which is another interesting piece of technology. It's basically an organ that plays emotions instead of music. At least that's what I gathered. They don't really go into detail about how it works, but what I gathered is that it's an organ that where instead of playing music, you actually hook it up to you put on this helmet, and you actually stimulate different centers of your brain and play different emotions. So, and then player pianos, and I'll just read this to you. Then they started building exact simulacra, which I'm going to use the word android because I prefer that, of famous men. They thought that people would pay a good price to have anyone they wanted made to order, to talk with, or to utilize. Now this description here is a little bit misleading, because they don't actually get into that. They never really talk about what they intend. I mean, I think what they really intended was to do Civil War reenactments with the androids. Have an Abraham Lincoln, have a Stanton, who is the Secretary of State, and they built a Stanton before they built the Lincoln. And I think that, yeah, that was their intention, was like the Civil War, have it be a Civil War reenacting group of androids. And then they ran into trouble. For one thing, an exactly programmed reconstruction of a noted personality is going to be as obstinate and character complex as the real man was, and nobody's puppet. And that is the case, particularly with the Stanton, but with Lincoln as well. They can't completely control them. They do make their own decisions, and they have the same personalities and demons and stuff as the real men did. For another, they got involved with a project for settling the moon with their creations, and finally they got tangled up with their own personal identities. That last sentence pretty much swallows up the last 50 pages of the novel. The whole thing about getting involved with a project for settling the moon with their creations, that's in reference to they approached this businessman, this industrialist named Sam Barrows, who is kind of a real estate mogul, and he's trying to colonize the moon. But the only way to colonize the moon and sell real estate on the moon, he wants to sell tract housing on the moon, which is kind of funny. His plan is to settle every third house or second house with a android family, to make the settlers feel more comfortable, to make the settlers feel like there were already people on the moon, basically seeding the moon with these fake families, so that to sort of prime things for the real settlers. Nothing ever comes of that, because Barrows and the two business partners, Louis Rosen and Maury Rock, can't really come to any agreements about anything. And Barrows becomes kind of a frenemy, where they're afraid that he's actually going to steal their ideas and their concepts before that they can make use of them. And then one thing they don't mention on the back here is a girl named Pris. Pris is Maury Rock's daughter, and Louis ends up falling in love with Pris. And Pris is mentally ill. She is, quote, schizophrenic. but that's kind of loaded because in this novel, that word gets thrown around a lot, and as the novel progresses, you become aware of the fact that this alternate 1980s, there is kind of a mental health hysteria going on. There's this statistic people keep throwing around that like 1 out of every 3 people is mentally ill and needs to be institutionalized. And there are these enormous institutions in every major city. And it's interesting because in some ways it mirrors our own time and our own reality in the 2010s and 2020s. Because I would say that in the 2010s and 2020s, there has also been a sense of mental health hysteria. But the key difference is that in this world, mental illness is overdiagnosed, but also overtreated. Whereas in our world, I would argue that mental illness is overdiagnosed, but it's undertreated. People who actually have real problems have a hard time getting help because there's such a glut of people seeking help for just kind of this anxiety that the anxieties of life that aren't really it's hard to say. I'm trying to say this in a diplomatic way, but there are a lot of people who self-diagnose, and they either self-diagnose or they go to a psychiatrist who subscribes to the affirmative therapy method, which is a method of psychiatry that is becoming more and more popular, where if the patient claims to have a certain condition, you really you can't counter that. You can't contradict that. You have to basically affirm whatever the patient says. And I'm simplifying it a little bit, but there are a lot of doctors like that, where, and especially if the patient themselves has looked up on Wikipedia what the symptoms are, and they know exactly what to say to this doctor to say, oh, I have OCD, I have anxiety, I have depression, whatever, then they get their prescription, and then they also, of Xanax or whatever, what have you, which I can't stand Xanax. I've tried it, and I'll never take it again. But it just creates this. There's this glut of people self-diagnosing and making it so that the people who need the most extreme help. I mean, I'm not saying that maybe those people don't need help, but the people who have severe issues who need help, it makes it harder. And interestingly enough, in the 1980s. During the Reagan administration, and it was a bipartisan thing, Democrats and Republicans, there was the deinstitutionalization method, where the process started where all of the institutions in the U.S. got shut down over the course of the next 20 or 30 years. And Democrats supported this because it was a way to get rid of institutions that were considered outdated and mistreatful and help mentally ill people integrate into society. And then Republicans loved it because it's a way to save money and cut funding. So it was a bipartisan movement that I think was one of the worst decisions that our government has made in the last 30 years, or for 35 years now. But it's funny because in this novel, the very opposite took place. In the 1980s, 70s, and 80s, there was a hyper-institutionalization, what's the word? Infrastructure, where every major city was, there was a major institution built, and like it was a revolving door of just millions of people, millions of Americans being prescribed or being diagnosed with. They always just say schizophrenia. That's like there are sub categories, but they always just call it phrenia, is what they call it, with an apostrophe and then PHRENIA. Just phrenia is like the slang term that they use. And that's an ongoing thing throughout the novel. And as the story progresses, and they're just interacting with the androids and interacting with Barrows and just trying to get something off the ground with these androids, Louis Rosen, who's kind of the main character of the story, he ends up kind of just really falling for this Pris. And Pris is this very cold girl. She's 18 years old. She's cold. She's analytical. She has a hard time processing her emotions. She really acts like she doesn't like Louis at all. She acts like she doesn't like her father, doesn't like anyone. And Louis is fascinated by this girl and is just captivated by how different she is and how dysfunctional she is. And he ends up falling in love with her. And I honestly feel like, knowing what I know of Philip K. Dick, that Louis was a self-insert for Dick, because, pun not intended, but he was a self-insert because I watched a documentary where they talked about how Philip K. Dick had a weakness for women, and particularly mentally ill women who were petite and thin and had black hair. And that perfectly describes Pris in this novel. So I think that Pris is kind of Philip K. Dick's almost like perfect woman, dream woman, as sick as that is, because she's really kind of an awful person in this novel. And then Louis is his self-insert, pursuing this woman, and basically it's kind of unrequited love. And that's ultimately what this story becomes, is just this unrequited love story. And it becomes less about the androids, and that's what I don't like, because I found the androids to be very interesting, particularly Lincoln. And I wanted to mention something in particular. Lincoln, I guess that Dick must have done a lot of research on Lincoln, because Lincoln is he feels like a real person. And there comes, every once in a while, Dick actually has to refer to Lincoln as it, or as the simulacra, because just to make sure that the reader doesn't forget that this isn't actually Lincoln. This is a simulation of Lincoln. And but it's interesting the decisions that he made in creating this character and trying to figure out what Lincoln would have been like if he had been recreated as an android, or what a simulation of Lincoln would be like. One thing that's interesting is, like, Louis actually goes to Lincoln for advice a lot to try to win over Pris, because Lincoln had some romantic love interests in his life that didn't work out, and that kind of mirrored Louis's experience a little bit. So, and Lincoln is very happy to help. That's one thing. And I wish there had been more Lincoln in this story, because Lincoln is a very endearing character. He's very polite. He's gracious. He's always willing to help. He actually helps. He actually acts as the lawyer for these two guys in their company. But he acknowledges that his knowledge is out of date, so he has to hit the books and learn the law of this alternate 1980s. He's just very helpful, very willing to help, very polite, very caring. He's, Louis keeps going to Lincoln for help, and Lincoln takes it very seriously and wants to help Louis, and it's very endearing and really kind of cool that and that's the best thing about this novel, is that the Lincoln character that Philip K. Dick created. One interesting little detail is that Abraham Lincoln loves reading children's books. Like they mention that he reads when he in his downtime he reads Winnie the Pooh and Peter Pan, and he loves them. And he's like he just sits in the corner and chuckles and laughs and just thinks they're delightful books. And he even wants to read them out loud to the other people and say, "Oh, you've got to hear this. This is so great." So I thought that was interesting that Dick made that decision to have Lincoln be this guy who's just very fond of children's stories, and it made me wonder if the real Lincoln would have been like that. Yeah, and you have these Yeah, I mean, in this world, you have 3D TVs. You have Life magazine has a nude spread, which I got a laugh out of. Um, the president is named Mendoza, and President Mendoza has been in an institution himself. So there's no stigma at all with that. I mean, it's a society where there's absolutely no stigma on mental illness at all anymore. And it's interesting because in our society, in our 2021, that's what people fight for, is for there to be no stigma on mental illness whatsoever. And this book kind of, I don't know if Dick was intending this or not, but it kind of shows how you need a certain amount of stigma when it comes to mental illness, because otherwise people just totally lose it. And they're willing to throw themselves into an institution when they have the slightest hiccup in their mental state. So it's really interesting. It's strangely relevant to our own time, in our own era, in reality. But there are also these nuclear mutations, like Louis's brother his face is upside down, just like the kid from Family Guy. And these mutations were caused by the nuclear tests that occurred in the 1950s and 60s, which is kind of odd, because most of the adults, if this takes place in the 1980s, most of those adults would have already been born by the time those tests took place. So Dick wasn't being very careful in doing the math when it came, but he never was. Like, a lot of Dick's novels take place in the too near future. They should take place about 50 years later. I think that the original Blade Runner story took place in like 1992. I mean, come on, like the idea that we would have like advanced robotics by 1992. I mean, but of course it was a more optimistic time for technology because it was the late 60s and we were about to land someone on the moon, so we kind of thought we could do anything. So it's a little bit understandable, but yeah. So I'm kind of in the home stretch of this review. I just want to read a few excerpts to you that I found interesting. Let's see, page 132. Yeah. Yeah. He's talking about Pris, this woman he's in love with. The future belongs to her. I realized as I examined the picture, whether she appears nude on a goat hair vegetable dye rug in life, or becomes the president's mistress for a weekend, or dances madly naked from the waist up while flaming knives are hurled at her during a kiddies TV program, she is still real, still beautiful and wonderful, like the hills and the ocean. No one can destroy that or spoil that, however angry or wretched they feel. What do Maury and I have? What can we offer her? Only something moldy, something that reeks, not of tomorrow but of yesterday, the past, of age, sorrow, and old death. And I thought that passage was interesting because you can really kind of feel Philip K. Dick's own pessimism about himself in a lot of what he writes. He writes in this very conversational tone where I hate to say it, but it almost reminds me of my own inner mind. Another writer that really does that to me is George Orwell. In his books, not just his novels, but his prose writing. The way he thinks is very similar to the way I think, and Philip K. Dick is that way too. He kind of reminds me of the way I think in my own mind. But what he's referring to there is when Pris leaves the organ company for Barrows, who she has this kind of girly crush on, and she's actually the one who brought Barrows to their attention. But here we go, 134. Mentions the Boeing 900. Oh, this is interesting. This is his commentary on Seattle. If you wonder what San Francisco would have looked like if there had been no earthquake and fire, you can find out by going to Seattle. It's an old seaport town built on hills with windy canyon-type streets. Nothing is modern except the public library, and the slum part you'll see cobblestone and red brick, like parts of Pocatello, Idaho. The slums extend for miles and are rat-infested. In the center of Seattle, there are a prosperous, genuine city-like shopping area built near one or two great old hotels, such as the Olympus. The wind blows in from Canada, and when the Boeing 900 sets down at the SeaTac airfield, you catch a glimpse of the mountains of origin. They're frightening. So that kind of unflattering description of Seattle I found interesting, considering recent events too. And page 142. Yeah, here he goes. That's what's meant by maturity, I said to myself as I sat on the bed shining my shoes. Being able to conceal your real feelings, being able to erect a mask, being able even to fool a big man like Barrows. If you can do that, you've made it. Otherwise, you've finished. The whole secret's there. I found that interesting. That maturity is being able to conceal your real feelings and being able to erect a mask. And then 150. This is right here is the point where the novel kind of turned around and turned into something different and kind of, in my opinion, kind of went off the rails. And he's talking about asking the Lincoln for advice, or yeah. So I guess it's a little bit later. It's more like maybe the 160 page mark that that things kind of changed or kind of took a turn. 155. Yeah, he asks him, "What did you think of the Sandberg book about your life?" And Lincoln's android says, "I have not yet had time to form an opinion." He's read it, but he hasn't had time to form an opinion about it. I found that interesting. He asked the Lincoln what he thought of this of one of the most famous biographies of him. 183. This is the last passage here. Yeah, this is where the doctor is. The doctor is examining him, the psychologist, and he's using this diagnosis tool where he tells him a bunch of old sayings, and Louis has to tell him what those old sayings mean. And when he gets to "a rolling stone gathers no moss," he can't remember the meaning. He says, "At last I hazarded, well, it means the person who's always active and never pauses to reflect." No, that doesn't sound right. I tried again. "A man who is always active and keeps growing in mental and moral stature won't grow stale." And Dr. Nisia says that that's what made him realize that was the what diagnosed him as having this illness, is that apparently that's the wrong interpretation of the saying, which I found funny because I always thought I always thought that that's what that expression meant. So, and I don't know if it really does mean the opposite, and that's what Dick was making the point that, I honestly don't know for sure what that expression means, but I always just assumed that that's what it meant. Now, I don't, like I said, I don't know if the opposite really is true, and that's kind of the point, that the doctor is just using this faulty diagnosis tool and whatever, but I found that kind of interesting. But yeah, the other books, Philip K. Dick novels I've read are The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, Flow My Tears, The Policeman Said, and A Scanner Darkly. And now we can add We Can Build You to the list. And I have a few more to read, and I will keep reading them. But this is not one of his best, in my opinion. It's not bad, but I feel like it got derailed by his own kind of the weirdness of maybe his own life kind of interfering with the novel itself. But and as you can see, it has the green sticker on it. I put the green sticker. I told you about that in the last video about how I've been color coding all of my novels now so that I know which ones I've read. Well, I mean, I would know anyway, but it's just so that I can look at a bookshelf at a glance and see which books I've read. They all have the green sticker. Another thing that I wanted to mention is, if any of you are wondering what makes the perfect bookmark, it's a paper clip. This is no, it's not the gold one. I got some gold ones from my accountant, but yeah, these make the perfect paper clips, or the perfect bookmarks, because you can just slide them in there and like that, and they actually, like, you can leave it right at the line that you ended at. So I've been using paper clips as bookmarks now for the last couple of books, and it's probably what I'll do for the rest of my life, because I really can't think of a better bookmark than a paper clip when it comes to functionality. So anyway, that's pretty much it. And the next, well, I guess maybe I won't tell you what the next one is, but it'll be an interesting one. It's a little bit shorter than this one, and we'll hopefully you'll find out in a month or so. But let me know what you think of Philip K. Dick. What's your favorite Philip K. Dick novel? Have you read this one, and what do you think of it? Leave me all of those comments. I'd love to hear anything you have to say. Make sure to like this video, and if you like the kind of stuff I'm into, and all you have to do is like look at the last few videos I've made to get a pretty good idea. That's always the case. You look at like about the last 5 videos I've made, you pretty much have a pretty good idea of the kind of stuff I do. But it's mostly kind of a hobbyist channel. But if you're into just like this kind of guy who just makes videos about whatever he finds interesting, make sure to subscribe to my channel, Captain Unusual. I just hit 1,000 subs, and thank you to everyone for that. My lifetime goal is to hit 10,000. I don't know if I want to necessarily go any higher than that, but we'll see how it goes. But thanks for watching. Have a good day, and I'll see you in the next review.